My name is Matt McCoy, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy in the Perelman School of Medicine. And today I'm talking about a paper I recently published with colleagues here called Ethical Responsibilities for Companies That Process Personal Data. In a nutshell, the primary problem that we set out to address in the paper is the fact that it's become increasingly difficult, virtually impossible for any of us to control who has access to personal information about us. What they do with that information, who they sell it to, how they use it to target advertisements to us. And so we tried to think about what a better ethical framework for control and protection of this data might look like. People often ask, because we have HIPAA, and that gives us protection for our health information, why do we have additional concerns about data privacy? Why do we need another ethical framework? Why do we need more laws here? And I think that's a very good question. But the reason that we do need more here is that HIPAA actually has a pretty narrow remit. So HIPAA provides robust protections for information about our health and our healthcare that's generated during clinical encounters. But there's all sorts of information about our health that can be gleaned from the kinds of things we do online, like what sorts of purchases we make, what sorts of websites we visit, that can actually be quite revealing about our health, about the health of our families, and that is all completely outside the purview of HIPAA. So one way that I've heard it put, which I think captures this paradox very nicely, is that when it comes to protecting health information in the United States, it's as if the front door is locked by HIPAA, but the back door is wide open. The goal of the project was to develop an ethical framework for companies that process personal data that could be used as a set of ethical guidance for companies that want to voluntarily do better than they're currently doing when it comes to handling personal data, but also a framework that could act as a basis for the eventual federal legislation that we think is ultimately required to ensure that we have consistent and robust protections for our online privacy. There's been a lot of work in recent years of people trying to figure out what a better approach to protecting our privacy online might look like, but a lot of that work is a little bit scattered. Sometimes the connection between the underlying ethical principles and the practical imperatives is not very well drawn. So what we wanted to do in a very systematic and rigorous way was to start by saying, okay, what are the foundational ethical principles that we need to start with here? And then very deliberately work from those towards a set of practical imperatives for companies to collect and process personal data, so that we had a very clear map that companies and regulators could operate from when figuring out how this ecosystem could work better. There are 6 underlying principles in the ethical data practices framework. 3 of those principles are what we call substantive principles, and 3 of those principles are what we call procedural principles. The substantive principles are minimizing harm, fairly distributing benefits and burdens, and respecting individual autonomy. The 3 procedural principles are transparency, accountability, and inclusion. We don't have a comprehensive federal privacy law right now. Some states have passed comprehensive privacy laws that afford some of these protections, but to have robust federal protection across all 50 states, what we need is a federal law that does this and isn't limited to certain kinds of health information like HIPAA is. There have been some attempts recently to develop bills that would create a comprehensive federal privacy protection framework in the United States, but unfortunately none of those have succeeded in Congress so far. I think that it's extremely unlikely that companies' voluntary compliance with ethical data standards is going to be sufficient to protect us from the kinds of harms we face in the modern data economy. But the question we face is, what can we do right now? We're in a very bad situation. Congress has showed that they haven't been able to pass comprehensive privacy legislation. So the question that we face now is, what do we do in the meantime? Companies doing a little bit better with respect to voluntary compliance with ethical data standards. It's a small step, it's an incremental step, and it's an incomplete step. But it might be one way that we can make a little bit of progress in the meantime while we wait for Congress to act in this area. I would also say that even if we do eventually find ourselves in an environment where Congress passes comprehensive privacy legislation, there's still going to be a limit to how much the federal government can oversee and regulate and penalize companies for violation of a federal privacy code. So there still is a need to develop good internal practices and good self-regulation within companies, even if we know that on its own it's going to be completely insufficient for where we need to be. The implications of this work for policymakers are that we know what a better privacy and data protection regime would look like, and now it's incumbent upon policymakers, it's incumbent upon advocates putting pressure on policymakers to figure out a way to actually pass legislation and to put into practice the kind of recommendations that we make in this paper.